Hi guys, so someone just asked what is the next step and how to manage a patient with an HbA1c of 14%, fasting glucose in excess of 10, and the patient is on 1 gram metformin and further on a sulfonylurea, in this case dietlicide. So there were a few questions. The first question in terms of the management, but I think a lot of the other questions links with it. And the first concept that we need to understand is the concept of glucotoxicity. So we often forget that the beta cell in itself is an end organ for hyperglycemia. By that, I mean that there's microvasculature around the beta cells, and the beta cells rely on these oxygen supply from there to actually make insulin. Now, if the glucose is high enough, and people often ask how high is high, well, it's advisable to not intervene, to not evaluate if the glucose is more than 10, but obviously there's a range that varies. So we get this entity called glucotoxicity, and glucotoxicity is basically due to the fact that these microvasculature itself doesn't supply the beta cell adequately, and the reason for this is hyperglycemia. So it's, if you may, a microvascular complication of diabetes. This is why we often advise to initiate insulin above a certain glucose level, but it's not to say that you have to continue with insulin. So back to this patient, the right thing to do would be to use insulin correction doses to bring the glucose down, to give the patient a basal insulin to optimize the metformin of the patient, and I would bring the glucose down with pre-meal correction doses. You might know something like an insulin sliding scale. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to pre-meal correction doses. And the reason for this is that if you initiate insulin now, you bring the glucose down, the beta cells might be able to make insulin again. So the patient doesn't necessarily have to stay on insulin. But the SEMSA guidelines advise that an HbA1c at any time point of more than 10% warrants insulin initiation, not suggesting that the patient should stay on it. So I've got a few patients actually that present in diabetic ketoacidosis. They've got type 2 diabetes. We insulinize them initially, and a lot of them, if they change their dietary habits, they actually get to a place where we can discontinue the insulin. But you first need to get rid of the glucose toxicity, and the only way to do that is with correction doses of insulin.